All right, ladies and gentlemen, then let us turn our attention officially to the 2:45 point on your agenda. We will adjust accordingly, so we're going to go a little bit later than the 4:30 adjournment, but we'll adjust as well as we can as we go through the day. Education and post-secondary education, another major plank in what we all call a social determinants of health approach. And we are joined by the Deputy Minister for the Ministry of Advanced Education, Jennifer McCrea, and the Assistant Deputy Minister, Jeff Vasey. I'll ask them to please come and join us here. I think they're going to speak from the table, so we'll ask them to join us there. And we do have some handheld mics and the remote that is there. And once they're done, we'll open back up for the leadership strategy discussions. So please, let's help make them welcome.
Good afternoon. I am Jennifer McCrea. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Education, and I would like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people. I also have the honor of bringing greetings from our Deputy Minister, Dave Bing. He does regret not being able to join us this afternoon, but I would like to share that Dave is extremely committed to improving education experience for First Nations students and believes in providing a strong foundation for students to set them up for success in their life. He does participate in quarterly meetings with the First Nations Education Steering Committee and takes a very active role in the work that we do. I would also like to recognize Ted Cadwallader, our Provincial Director of Aboriginal Education, that's here with me today. And I would like to extend a thank you to the First Nations Health Council, who has included education in this very important topic around the social determinants of health. We do have a strong collaborative relationship with the First Nations Education Steering Committee in Education, as well as the First Nations School Association. During our sessions, we heard the importance of listening and listening about community and from community. And one of the outreach activities that we've been doing in the Ministry of Education is meeting directly with First Nations communities in order to improve the education system for First Nations. And we recognize that it's there in community, hearing directly and helping build relationships between First Nations and the school district is how we'll bring a change. We are currently participating in the FNESC's regional sessions that are happening around the province, and we have a number of guiding documents that are helping us determine which direction to go with our work. The Auditor General has recently released a report in Outcomes for Aboriginal Students, the Truth and Reconciliations Commission report, the Tripartite Education Framework Agreement, and we do have an MOU and protocol with the First Nations Education Steering Committee and a detailed work plan, and of course, the Memorandum of Understanding with the First Nations Health Council. We recognize that we have a lot of work to do. We need to do that work together to improve outcomes and experiences for First Nations students, and the work is definitely underway. We know that all students must learn about our collective history. They must learn about the Indian Act, residential schools, court decisions, Aboriginal rights and titles, resiliency, and the vibrancy of First Nations in British Columbia. And that is why we have ensured that there is Aboriginal perspectives embedded in each part of our curriculum in the K-12 sector. And FNESC had a representative on each one of our curriculum teams to ensure that we were honoring the Aboriginal voice in order to improve results for our students. We're helping to support local education agreements between First Nations and school districts, and we're working to increase the capacity of teachers and staff by supporting classroom resources that are authentic to the First Nations voice. And last year, province-wide, we dedicated a professional development day for all teachers to focus on Aboriginal education. So what have we seen around student success to date? Last year, Aboriginal student completion rate was 64%. That number is not good enough, and it's not high enough, but it is trending in the right direction. It was up 1% over the previous year, and that was at a time where non-Aboriginal completion rate remained constant. However, First Nations status students, it was only 53%. While that is an increase over previous years, it is absolutely not acceptable. We are focusing on language and culture, and I'm pleased to say that we have 16 languages currently available for use in our schools. That's also not representative of the number of First Nations that we have in this province. So we are continuing to do that work and bring language and culture in our schools. And Haida is currently in the approval process, so that will be number 17 shortly. We know that the First Nations language and culture must be a part of our education system for all students. And I'm so proud to say that last year we were able as a province to work with band schools to ensure they had access to provincial exams. And we had the first 2 students from First Nation schools receive the dogwood this past June. Clap for that. That was really great. But we also know that we have to make sure that our students are graduating our system with a quality dogwood and moving on to post-secondary. What we heard was there was an overuse of the Evergreen School Completion Certificate. The School Completion Certificate is a recognition of a student's accomplishments through the K-12 system where dogwood is not an option. You must have an individual education plan, and that is only done after having formalized assessments. So last year, at the end of the year, the minister restricted the use of this, and we are ensuring every student is on a pathway for a dogwood. We need to make sure we're paying attention to transitions in order to get students into secondary. It starts very, very early. We're looking at our youngest learners and making sure they have strong foundations to move on from grade to grade as early as transitioning into kindergarten. And wherever students go to school, whether it be an independent school, a band school, or a public school, we want them to be successful. We had the honor of being at all of the regional sessions that the First Nations Health Council hosted, and we listened in the regions. And we heard specific topics to each part of the province, and we heard many common themes. In Prince Rupert, we heard about the importance of First Nations languages, cultures, and history in our schools. In the coastal region, we heard about your challenges of transition and the importance that schools provide safe, nurturing environments. In Prince George, we heard about the importance of the school district and the First Nations communities working together. The Fraser Valley told us that the First Nations students must graduate with a dogwood, and that we have to be able to provide options for post-secondary and skills training. Williams Lake, we talked about the value of developing local resources to ensure that the students know the history, language, and culture of their traditional territory. Many common themes came right across the province. We, as the Ministry of Education and our school districts, must ensure that parents and students know what that pathway to graduation is, and we need to ensure that a student understands the pathway that they're on and what success looks like. We must address wait lists for students waiting for special education assessments, and we must ensure that mental health supports are in place for students when they need it early. First Nations teachers are definitely needed in every school in this province. And we need to ensure that the work that we are doing remains consistent with FNESC and with all of the efforts to modernize our education system. So as the Ministry of Education, as we develop our service plan, we're keeping our eye on Aboriginal outcomes, and we're ensuring that we support improved results. We're paying special attention to students that have special needs. We're looking at how we can provide mental health supports for students, and we're integrating the Truth and Reconciliation's call to action. We're continuing with our actions to move forward, often jointly with FNESC. Our graduation years will include Aboriginal content that's developed collaboratively, just as the K-9 model has happened. And the Office of the Auditor General has provided us with recommendations, and we are addressing all 11 recommendations. By the end of this year, end of this month, we will have a draft strategic plan to improve results that will be developed through broad outreach with our partners and with FNESC. We have seconded school district officials to work directly with the ministry to address the racism of low expectations as identified in the Auditor General's report. And we are working directly with our education partners, including FNESC, on that important piece of work. And we're changing the way we collect, analyze, and report out on data to ensure that Aboriginal student success remains a priority. We will continue to work very closely with our school districts to help them implement Aboriginal content in the curriculum for all students in this province.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Vasey. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister in the Ministry of Advanced Education, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I also send, or bring along rather, greetings from our Deputy Minister, Sandra Carroll, who could not be here today. But I want to also stress the commitment of the ministry, the deputy, and actually the minister as well in this important work. I had the privilege of actually attending all 5 regional sessions and listened to a lot of dialogue and kept the deputy and the minister apprised along the way. And so although they could not be here today, or the deputy could not be here today, very committed to the work and what's being presented. It's very well endorsed. What I'm going to do is actually, for some folks that could not be at the sessions, but also just for everybody in the room, give a very, very quick refresher of what we are doing, what we presented, talk a little bit about what we heard in the regional caucus sessions, and then finish up with some actions and our commitment for moving forward. So this slide was important in the regional sessions. This image is actually the cover of the framework. It's our Aboriginal Post-Secondary Education and Training Policy Framework and Action Plan. And it actually is our roadmap that I presented in the regional sessions and then went through the series of goals. It was released in 2012, and important how we actually arrived at this. Bear with me. I want to not miss anybody here. It was developed by a working group of Aboriginal post-secondary education and training partners, including FNESC and IALA, Métis Nation BC, BC Colleges, BC Association of Institutes and Universities, Research Universities Council of British Columbia, Ministry of Advanced Education, and other provincial ministries and federal departments. It was a 2-year engagement process. It was actually released in 2012, and it's a document that gives a roadmap until 2020. And so at this point in time, we're halfway through implementing that policy framework. When we presented this framework in the regional caucus sessions, we asked the question, are we going in the right direction? And what we pretty much heard at every session is that, yeah, we need to actually tweak or finesse or perhaps look at different ways of implementing some of the actions. But generally speaking, we're going in the right direction. And that was, thank you very much for that feedback and that validation. In addition to this policy framework, we do continue to work. Yesterday, from the floor, at the end of the day, there was some interesting dialogue about the role of FNESC, and I wanted to ensure people that we actually work very closely with FNESC and IALA, and we actually do have a signed protocol agreement with FNESC to continue moving forward the action items in this framework. In addition to that, though, it has been great value for the ministry to be invited to these regional sessions and to actually have sort of to hear personally from chiefs and from communities their stories of how things are working or not working so well. And so I want to thank you. It was a lot of very useful listening. So in terms of the framework, I'll do this very quickly because I said we actually did go through this in the regional sessions. If folks that couldn't be there, though, we actually did bring a bunch of copies of the framework for folks that want more detail. I'll go through some of these actions quite quickly. Goal number 1 is about systemic change, and systemic change means that the public post-secondary education system is relevant, responsive, respectful, and receptive to Aboriginal learners and community. And so what are we doing? The big piece here is actually about increasing Aboriginal voice. So it really is about increasing the number of Aboriginal people on boards of governors for the 25 post-secondary, and we have almost 100% on that one. We actually are providing financial support for Aboriginal graduates. I won't go through all the detail, but the bottom line is we have annual $5,000 support for Aboriginal students enrolled in master's and doctoral programs. We have 11 institutions that have Aboriginal service plans, and that includes supporting elders and residents, cultural learning and mentoring. We have 31 Aboriginal gathering places in institutions around the province. And then as part of this sort of systemic change, we had all of the 25 post-secondary institutions come together this past October for a 2-day summit to actually share and discuss what they're doing to meet the TRC commitments. Fascinating dialogue. The ministry is committed to actually working with all of our partners to keep that dialogue relevant and current, and to actually keep a forum alive for sharing best practices so we can actually move forward in a successful way. Thanks, John. In terms of goal 2 in the framework, it's about community-based delivery. And so in terms of community-based delivery, there's really 3 basic programs. Again, I won't go into the number details, but they're programs that we have in place. We have the ministry funds partnerships between Aboriginal communities and public post-secondary institutions to deliver programs in communities. And we have language programs are funded through the Aboriginal Community-Based Training Partnerships Program. And the third one is the Aboriginal Community Adult Literacy Programs. And I realize I'm going through this quickly. As I said, it's all in the framework that you can get copies for online or here. Goal 3, reduce financial barriers to accessing and completing post-secondary education and training are reduced for Aboriginal learners. And this really is about so far, to date, we have provided $4.3 million for Aboriginal Emergency Financial Assistance Fund to support Aboriginal students experiencing a short-term financial crisis. If folks have to go back to their community for any kind of emergency, this fund can be accessed to actually support them in doing so. As well, there's a $12 million endowment, and that goes towards every year a range of awards between $1,000 and $3,500 for Aboriginal students. Probably most importantly on this slide, though, is our commitment to work with FNESC to keep discussing with the federal government their commitment to increase post-secondary student support by $50 million annually. There is no doubt that support for post-secondary Aboriginal students is lacking. We do not have the money we need. There was a commitment federally, and we actually are committed to work with FNESC to keep dialoguing with the federal government to follow through with that. Goal number 4 is about post-secondary transition, and ambitious goals in the framework really are aimed at increasing transition from grade 12 to post-secondary education to 90% by the year 2020. And as Jennifer said, the graduation right now is around 64%? Yeah. So my number is a little bit different here, but nonetheless, it's mid-60s. So we do have a ways to go on that one. Also, we have $2 million in funding for the Aboriginal Teacher Education Award, $5,000 awarded annually to Aboriginal students enrolled in teacher education programs in BC, including First Nations language teacher education programs. And as well, in terms of transitions, we have 2 new guides that actually support parents in helping them to help their children navigate the system. So goal number 5, which I don't have a slide for, is about continuous improvement based on research, data tracking, and shared leading practices. And that was also discussed in the regional sessions, and we're keeping our eye on that one as well. So that's what we talked about in terms of what the ministry presented, but more importantly, what we heard. So what we heard in the regional sessions is that there is support for the general direction that the Ministry of Advanced Education is going in terms of the Aboriginal Post-Secondary Education and Training Policy Framework. I wish it was a shorter name. Some of the things we heard, though, and this is just basically, it's not an exhaustive list. I apologize at the front. I should have acknowledged my colleague, Deborah Hull, who is here with me. Deborah also attended all of the 5 regional sessions with me, and we took very good notes of everything we heard. So we do have a fairly good compilation of what we heard in each region. The notes on this, or the bullets on this slide, we heard aspects of these things, of these bullets across the regions. But we also acknowledge that there is nuance. There is actually emphasis on certain issues in certain regions. So some of the things we heard. Post-secondary institutions need to develop relationships with local First Nation communities, understand protocols, and draw on local content. And so while this is happening in many places, it's not consistent across BC. And so what we heard in Vancouver Coastal, and this is in quotations, is that the community does not have a partnership with post-secondary. They don't know who we are. And that's a challenge because the way the province actually funds a lot of what's in the framework is through post-secondary education. The public post-secondary institutions. That's how the accountability framework is set up. And so even a lot of the programs about delivering in community, they're done in partnership with post-secondaries. And so if there is a lack of connection, that's something that the ministry is going to have to work on better to help make connections. We need more supports for parents, information on course selection, pathways, student supports, in formats that work for all parents. They actually acknowledge literacy levels, audio-visual, and in Vancouver Island, we did hear this, we had quite a good dialogue on that one. In quotations again, parents need to know their kids are on the right path, they're on the right course. We actually talked a lot about, in Vancouver Island as well, about literacy level for parents, and actually that can be a barrier. And it's, so not just post-secondary education, we actually need to look at literacy courses for parents and actually language supports for parents as well. Also, we heard about supports that maybe are internet-based or audio-visual, so that they actually also another way of accommodating literacy barriers so that parents could be well informed. We also heard that the First Nations needs more data on how we are doing. So in the regional sessions, I did hand out one-pagers about what a snapshot of what the region looked like. A lot of folks had never seen any data like that. And actually, in Vancouver Coastal, I actually talked about how the province reads that data, and I mentioned that there are a lot of Aboriginal learners who are succeeding in trades, but not so many in bachelor's, in master's, and postdocs, and other types of careers. And I think I probably misspoke because I said there's an overrepresentation, to which a response to me was like, what do you mean there's an overrepresentation? We're having a high success here. Isn't that a good thing? And so then, in quotations, whose yardstick are we using to measure success? And I thought that was actually a really valid point. And so the idea of providing better information, better data to First Nations communities so they can actually help us understand what success looks like, it was a valuable point. We also, a big issue across all the discussions had to do with the fact that a lot of folks, a lot of kids are having to leave the community for post-secondary, and it's hard for many students. And we need to address broadband access issues so students can actually stay in their community. And specifically in the Fraser region, we actually had a really good dialogue about that one. And we were actually challenged, in fact, to think outside the box. Students don't want to leave community. How can we actually collaborate and deliver programming differently so that people can be successful by still having the support of their community in their community? So we've heard that loud and clear. And there's an imperative that students learn language and culture. And when I say students here, we heard it's imperative that all students actually learn about culture and that Aboriginal students learn about language. And, sorry, my notes, I'm going back and forth. Oh, yes, so a really, really important point. It was actually, to me, what really stood out was in the northern region, there was actually a really important point because we did talk a lot about reconciliation, and we all talked a lot about residential schools. And it was mentioned, again, in quotations, don't forget to talk about success. Yes, teach about residential school history, but also teach about how vibrant and resilient our people are. And I thought that was a really good point to bring balance to it, that yes, there's a lot we need to do, but there's also a lot of success and a lot of success based on resilience. I want to end off. There's a couple of things in the past day, and actually through the sessions. A lot was discussed about capacity, and just these statements here really are about the fact there's not enough funding at the community level, not enough federal funding, there's not enough flexibility. Our system is proposal-based, meaning that funding is handed out based on written proposals, and that means there's a lack of predictability or sustainability, and all that puts pressure on communities to actually put submissions forward. We've heard that as well. I don't have an answer today, but we have heard that in our thinking. And then lastly, interesting discussions about leadership. So not so much degrees and credentials, but actually leadership qualities that thinking about post-secondary education, not just in terms of degrees and certificates, but actually leadership skills that you learn that help you go back into your community and be effective. And we had a lot of dialogue about that as well. Please, thanks, Jen. So this all then comes down to our service plan. That was the commitment in this process. And these are early actions, a couple things in these slides. And I apologize, you will not see my face for a minute because this is very small print for me. So what the slide says, though, this is proposed wording for our actual service plan, that we continue to support the work of the First Nations Health Council in the development of a social determinants of health strategy and implement actions that are consistent with the strategy. Early actions will include providing funding for the development of a First Nations language degree to support the revitalization of First Nation languages. And the second one is developing an annual report on participation and outcomes of Aboriginal learners in BC public post-secondary systems. We think both those early, and again, those are early actions, things we can commit to today. There's more things we actually need to work on, though. That list that I just presented, thanks, Jen. That list that of what we heard, I do not have actions to respond to everything on that list. There is more work to be done and more dialogue that we actually look forward to having with the First Nations. We are very, I'll use the word excited actually, about co-planning and collaborative problem solving to find new ways of delivering. So yes, we have a policy framework, but it really comes down to how are you going to deliver it? What's the implementation look like? And what we've heard loud and clear is we need to think about different ways of delivering, and we look forward to continued collaboration to do exactly that. So I'll finish off by saying, as I said, we look forward to being your partners, to being your collaborators, apologies, and commitment to work alongside yourselves to put together the 10-year strategy for social determinants of health for First Nations. So thank you.